Hello, welcome once again to How to Do Stuff and Things. I'm your good friend Bradley, and today you find me wearing the stereotypical uniform of the Pacific Northwesterner. The rain jacket, the stocking cap, and I'm wearing this because today I'm going to teach you how to pronounce Pacific Northwest place names. Now, few things will tip off the locals that you're a tourist more glaringly than you mispronouncing a lot of the kind of strange Pacific Northwest place names. Except maybe carrying an umbrella. Nobody in the Pacific Northwest carries an umbrella. Now, a lot of the names in the Pacific Northwest, names for cities and towns and regions, are based on Native American names, so some of them are a little bit difficult for people who aren't from the Pacific Northwest to pronounce. And you'll often see maybe local news people who are from other regions of the U.S. coming to the Pacific Northwest and then mispronouncing a lot of the place names in the Pacific Northwest. So let's get into this list. I've just picked some that are more commonly mispronounced, most of them focused on the state of Washington, which is where I'm from. If there's anything I miss in this video, let me know in the comments and maybe we'll do a part 2 and I'll tell you how a Pacific Northwest native might pronounce that particular name. Oh, and one more thing before we start. I should mention that the Pacific Northwest is the northwestern region of the contiguous U.S. That's the definition for the Pacific Northwest for the purposes of this video. Some people include Idaho in this, but I mostly just include Washington and Oregon. So, let's get started with the very first one. Now, so many people mispronounce this state name. Many people who live in the United States, they pronounce the name Oregon. And nobody who lives in Oregon says Oregon. I was actually born in Oregon, and the way you pronounce this is you don't say Oregon, you say Oregon. There's a little bit of an after or, and then the gon is not gone, it's gun. So Oregon. But the is very, very, very slight. Oregon. Not Oregon, Oregon. Next, Washington, the name of the state I am in right now. This one is pretty simple. Most people pronounce this correctly, but you may hear some older people who actually live in Washington saying Washington. Now that is something that I think was more from a previous generation. My grandparents used to say Washington. So I guess technically you could say it's correct to say Washington because a lot of people native to Washington say Washington, but they're the older generation, and typically people who live in Washington just say Washington. Next, a city in southwestern Washington, Aberdeen. Many of you will have heard of this city because it's where Kurt Cobain grew up, famously spent his childhood and teenage years. This one is fairly simple, but I have heard some people say Aberdeen. It's Aberdeen. Aberdeen. Here's one that I hear so many people mispronouncing. It's Puyallup. But so many people want to say Puyallup or Puyallup. It's Puyallup. So there's a Puyallup. Puyallup. Next, a city on the coast where you can get ferries to the San Juan Islands. You might look at this name and think that it's Anacortes, but we pronounce it Anacortes. Anacortes. So the end is a tis, not a tes, and it's Anacortes. Anacortes. Now, speaking of the San Juan Islands, this is one of those islands, and we call it Orcas Island. Not orcas. It looks like an orca whale, but the plural form, but we say orcas, not orcas. Orcas Island. More of an us than an is, I guess, but Orcas Island. Another island, sort of near Seattle, this is called Camano Island. Not Camano. It looks like it should be, but we say Camano. Emphasis on the may. Camano Island. Another town in Washington, I think famous for being the home of the band Modest Mouse. This is Issaquah. Issaquah. Not Issaquah or Issaquah. Issaquah. Now you might look at this next one and think it's Tulalip or Tulalip, but it is Tulalip. Emphasis on the second syllable, Tulalip. There's an Indian reservation near here and a casino. The Tulalip Indian Reservation and the Tulalip Casino. Tulalip. Here's one that I never thought people would really mispronounce, but I've actually heard some people say Tacoma. It is Tacoma, a city in Washington south of Seattle. Tacoma. There's the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, or SeaTac for short. Tacoma. Here's a fun one. How would you pronounce this word just looking at it out of nowhere? A lot of people might say Mukilteo or Mukilteo. It is Mukilteo. Mukilteo. Another town in Washington. Mukilteo. Mukilteo. Now this one isn't a problem for most Americans. Most people have heard of Seattle. It's a very famous city, the biggest city in the Pacific Northwest. But I've heard international people from Germany, for instance, say Seattle or Seattle. It is Seattle. So emphasis on the second syllable, Seattle. Named after a Native American chief who was known as Chief Sealth, but who was also known as Chief Seattle. Seattle. Now this is a small town kind of near where I live in Bellingham, Washington. A lot of people would see this and say Cedro. Seems reasonable, Cedro, but it's actually Cedro. Cedro Woolley. A lot of people who live in Cedro Woolley just call it Woolley for short. Cedro Woolley. Here's a city in eastern Washington. A lot of people might pronounce this Wenatchee or Wenatchee, but it's Wenatchee. Second syllable stressed. Wenatchee. Wenatchee. Now I hear this one pronounced in so many different ways on newscasts and things, but the way we pronounce this in the Pacific Northwest is Yakima. Yakima. So the emphasis is on the first syllable there. Yakima. Now here are a couple from Oregon. The first, Tualatin, a town kind of on the outskirts of Portland, or part of the greater Portland metropolitan area. It is Tualatin. Tualatin. Tualatin, Oregon. And another one, Siuslaw. Siuslaw. Might be very difficult for people who are not from the region to be able to pronounce Siuslaw. And now for a couple bonus things. They're not place names, but they are sort of Pacific Northwest things. The first one, salmon is very popular in the Pacific Northwest. A lot of people fish for salmon. They go from Seattle and to Alaska to fish there. And salmon is a big deal here. And one of the most popular kinds of salmon is Chinook salmon. Chinook. So not Chinook, Chinook. Chinook salmon. Now here's a weird one. If you look at this word, you might think it's pronounced geoduck. Sounds like a Pokemon or something, but it's actually pronounced gooey duck. I don't know why, but that's how it's pronounced. Gooey duck. These are very large, very weird looking clams that are native to, I guess, sort of British Columbia down the coast through Oregon, maybe even into Northern California. But gooey duck, a very large clam with a very large phallic-shaped siphon on them. And a lot of people really love to eat them around here. Gooey duck. So hopefully you found that helpful. Like I said, if there are any words, place names, Pacific Northwest things that you would like me to explain, ask me in the comment section below, and maybe we'll do a part 2 of how to pronounce Pacific Northwest place names. Until next time, until we meet again, I've been your good friend Bradley, you've been the audience, and now you know how to do stuff and things. I'll see you later.